The morning my husband died, I was shelling peas at the kitchen table, and I remember that the bowl in my lap was blue, and the peas made a small dry sound against the bottom of it, and the clock above the wood stove ticked the way it had ticked for 23 years, and I was 39 years old, and I did not yet know that he was already gone in the west field, that the horse had come back without him, that the neighbor boy was already running down the lane with his hat in his hand. I remember the peas. I remember the blue bowl. I remember thinking that I should put more wood in the stove because the kitchen had gone cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather, and later, much later, an English woman in a beige office would teach me a word for that kind of knowing. But I did not have it yet. I did not have any words yet. What I had was the sound of boots on the porch, and the way the boy would not look at me, and the beginning of a year in which I would be forbidden to say almost everything I felt. My name is Martha. This is the Amish Stories, the channel where I tell the stories no one told me when I was a girl, the ones that were kept behind the prayer cap and folded into the hem of every apron I ever wore. I grew up Old Order Amish in Holmes County, Ohio. I was married at 18 and widowed at 39, and I left the community at 41, 2 years after my husband died, though the leaving had started long before I knew what leaving was. If you have ever lost someone and been told exactly how you were allowed to grieve them, tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight and whether your community made room for your sorrow or told you to fold it smaller. I read every single one. Subscribe if you have not yet, and like this video if you have ever swallowed a sentence for the sake of looking holy. There is a specific kind of grief that is not allowed to be grief, and that is what I want to talk about tonight. In the outside world, when a woman's husband dies, the world tries, however clumsily, to bend toward her. Neighbors bring casseroles for a week and then remember her every so often. There is a service. There are cards. She is expected eventually to move forward in whatever crooked way she can. In my community, when a woman's husband dies, the community bends toward her too, but the bending has a shape, and the shape is a cage. There is a code, unwritten as all our codes are unwritten, for how a widow moves through the first year. It does not have an official name in the Ordnung. It exists the way many things in Amish life exist. Everyone knows, no one says. The bishop does not explain it. Your mother does not sit you down. You learn it by breaking it. You learn it by the small correcting silences of the women who arrive at your door with bread and stay too long at your table, watching your hands, watching your face, listening for the wrong sentence. The hierarchy does not stop when your husband dies. God, then bishop, then husband, then wife. That is what I was taught from the time I could sit still on a wooden bench. When your husband dies, the line does not shorten. It reroutes. The bishop steps closer. Your husband's brothers step closer. Your own father, if he is still living, steps closer. And you, the widow, are expected to yield to all of them in the shape your husband left behind. Gelassenheit, the yielding, does not end at the graveside. It deepens. A woman without a husband is not a free woman in my community. She is a woman whose submission has been redistributed. Hochmut, pride, is the sin they watched me for most closely that year. The pride of a woman who might mistake her sudden aloneness for a kind of freedom. The pride of a woman who might begin to make decisions in her own name. His name was Jonas. We had met the way we all met, at a Sunday, singing. In a barn cleared of hay for the evening, kerosene lamps hanging low, boys on one side and girls on the other, hymns sung slow enough that you could study a face across the room without seeming to. He was 2 years older than me. He had good hands. He was not cruel. I want that on the record before I go any further, because the story I'm about to tell is not the story of a bad man. It is the story of a system that took a decent man and a decent woman and gave them a script neither of them had written, and then, when the script ran out, gave the woman a second script for how to mourn him, and punished her for reading it in her own voice. We were married on a Thursday in late October. 320 guests, 4 hours of preaching, roast chicken and creamed celery, and 7 kinds of pies set along the long tables in his father's basement. I had our first child within the first year, and 5 more after that. And by the time Jonas died in the West Field with the sun on his back and no one to see him fall, I had spent more than half my life inside the shape of being his wife. When he died, that shape did not disappear. It hardened. it became the shape I was expected to occupy for the rest of my days. The first thing they took from me was my voice at the funeral. I do not mean that they forbade me to speak. No one forbids anything directly in my community. I mean that when I opened my mouth to say something about him at the graveside, my husband's brother laid a hand on my forearm, gentle as a father with a child, and said, "The bishop will speak for the family, Martha." That was all. That was the whole correction. The bishop was a tall, gray bearded man who had known Jonas since he was a boy, and he spoke about Jonas with warmth and with knowledge, and everything he said was true, and none of it was mine. My grief was folded into his sentences the way a smaller quilt is folded inside a larger one. By the time we walked away from the grave, I understood without being told that my sorrow would be curated from that day forward. There would be a correct amount of it. There would be a correct expression of it. And there would be women watching to make sure I did not exceed or fall short of the shape. The second thing was the visits. In the first month, my kitchen was never empty. Women came with bread and pickled beets and choux pie, and they sat with me at the table, and their hands never stopped moving, snapping beans, folding a dishcloth, threading a needle, and their eyes moved over my face like a hand smoothing a bedsheet. They were listening for how I said his name. They were listening for whether I cried too much, or worse, whether I did not cry enough. A widow who does not cry enough has already begun to imagine a life without her husband, and that imagining is itself a kind of infidelity. A widow who cries too much is refusing to yield to the will of God, who took him. There's a narrow corridor between those two failures, and the corridor is the whole of your first year. The third thing was my clothes. This one I had known about, in the way we all knew about it, the way Amish women always learn things. Quietly, sideways from watching other widows before us. Black dress, black apron, black bonnet, black stockings. For a year at least. In some districts longer. It sounds simple. It is not simple. It is a uniform of grief that turns your body into a public sign. Every time I walked into the market, every time I sat down in church, every time I hung a wash line, my clothes announced to the community that I was still mourning, still submitting, still being watched. A widow who moves too quickly out of black is a widow who did not love her husband enough. A widow who wears black past the accepted term is a widow who is refusing to trust God's plan for the rest of her life. I was 39 years old, I had 6 children, and I understood, standing in front of the small mirror we kept nailed to the pantry door, that I would be reading the room's opinion of my grief in every fabric I put on my body for as long as I stayed. The fourth thing was the money. Jonas had left a small farm, 3 horses, a hay wagon, a herd of dairy cows, a workshop with tools he had inherited from his father, and a savings jar behind a loose board in the barn that I had known about for 11 years and had never once counted. Within 2 weeks of the funeral, his oldest brother, a kind man, I want to say this, a genuinely kind man, came to the kitchen and sat down across from me and said, gently, that we would need to talk about the farm. He did not say who we was. He did not need to. In our community, a widow does not run a farm. A widow does not decide when the hay is cut, or which cow is sold, or what price the milk brings at the co-op. These things are lifted from her hands with such gentleness that she does not, at first, notice they have been lifted. His brother said he would help. His father-in-law said he would help. The bishop said, in his warm way, that no widow should have to carry such things alone. And within 6 weeks of my husband's death, every decision about the land I had worked for 21 years was being made in a room I was not in. I did not object. That is the part I want to be honest about. I did not object because I did not yet have the vocabulary for objecting. In my community, a widow who objects to her brother-in-law's oversight is a widow whose grief has curdled into pride. I had been trained since girlhood to recognize Hochmut in myself the way a farmer recognizes rot in a fence post. I found it in myself and I cut it out. I said thank you. I served coffee. I let them decide about the cows, but something began to happen inside me that I could not name yet, and I am going to try, tonight, to describe it to you the way it actually felt, because I think there are women watching this who have felt it too, and I think it is important that we say it out loud, in whatever language we have. What began to happen inside me was that I began to notice, for the first time in my adult life, the exact shape of the room I had been standing in. When Jonas was alive, the room had been our room. His body inside it had made it feel like a life we were building together. Even when the building was hard, even when the silence between us grew long. When Jonas died, the room did not empty. It filled with other people: his brothers, his father, the bishop, the women with their moving hands. And I began to understand slowly, in the quiet nighttime hours after the children were asleep, that the room had never actually been ours. It had been the community's, always. Jonas had held a seat in it. Now other men were sitting in his seat, and I was still being asked to serve the coffee. Before I go on, I want to say thank you. If you have stayed with me this far, thank you. These are not easy things to say, and they are not easy things to hear. And I know that some of you are watching because you have carried something similar, and I want you to know I am aware of that as I speak. Subscribe to this channel if you have not yet. Like this video if any of it has landed somewhere real. There is more I have not yet said. The Lydia moment of that year came in the 9th month after Jonas died, and it came as those moments always come in our community, sideways, at a quilting frolic, delivered by a woman who was not looking at me while she said it. Her name was Ruth. She was 73 years old. She had been widowed twice, once at 31, once at 58. And she was, by any measure the community used, an exemplary widow. She wore black long, past the required term. She lived quietly with her son's family. She spoke rarely and never above a certain volume. That afternoon, she was threading a needle beside me at the frame, and the light from the kitchen window was falling across her hands, which were spotted and thin, and she said without looking up, "The first husband, you mourn. The second, you survive. What no one tells you, Martha, is that between the two of them, if you are lucky, there is a small window where you find out who you actually were before either of them." And then she pulled the thread tight and moved on to the next stitch. And she did not look at me for the rest of the afternoon, and she was dead within 2 years. And I have thought about that sentence almost every day since. I did not understand it at first. I understood it in the way you understand something you have not yet lived, as an idea passing through a room. But it stayed with me. I turned it over in my hands the way I turned over stones from the garden when I was a girl. A small window, who I actually was, before either of them. I began, in the 10th month, to do something small. I began to keep a notebook. I bought it in town from an English woman at a stationery counter, and I hid it in the pantry behind the flour bin. And at night, after the children were asleep and the kerosene lamp was burning low, I wrote in it. I did not write anything dangerous. I wrote what the weather had done that day. I wrote which cow had calved. I wrote what my youngest had said at supper. But the act of writing anything at all in a book that no one else would ever read was, I understand now, the first sentence I had ever composed in my own name. It was a small door. I did not yet know it was a door. The climactic decision, when it came the way those decisions always come in these stories, without drama, without a slammed door, without a raised voice. It was a Tuesday in early March. The snow was going soft on the north side of the barn. I was hanging a line of wash, my children's clothes, my own black dresses, a shirt of Jonas's that I had not yet given away, because giving it away had felt like a betrayal my community had not yet given me permission for. I was hanging that shirt on the line, and the wind moved through the empty sleeves, and I understood, standing there with a wooden clothespin in my mouth, that I had been wearing his life like a second skin for almost 22 years, and that the community around me had every intention of continuing to dress me in it for the next 30. Not out of cruelty, out of what they believed love was. His brother would decide about the farm, the bishop would decide about the children's schooling, the women with their moving hands would decide gently, endlessly, about my body and my clothing and my sentences. And I would grow old in a black dress that had ceased, long ago, to be about mourning Jonas, and had become instead about mourning any version of myself that might have existed without him. I took the shirt down, I folded it, I put it in a paper bag, and I understood, standing there in the March cold, that the decision had already been made in some quieter part of me months before, and that my body had only just now caught up to it. I will not tell the story of my leaving today because it belongs to a different video. I will only say that it happened 4 months later, in the summer, with the help of a Mennonite woman in a nearby town who had known too many widows like me. I took one bag. I took the notebook. I took the money from the barn jar that Jonas had shown me 11 years earlier and that no one else had counted. My oldest was already married. My youngest was 15. I did not take any of them with me, and I want to be honest about that too, because there are women who will not understand that choice, and there are women who will understand it too well. I have written about that decision elsewhere. I am still writing about it. I will be writing about it, I think, for the rest of my life. The letters came back unopened. Not all of them, but most. My mother's face I saw one more time, at a distance, at the edge of a market lot, and she looked through me the way my father had looked through me the last Sunday before I left, as if I were a pane of glass she could see the field behind. My daughters wrote to me at first, then stopped, then wrote again years later. My sons did not write. The click of the receiver when I called the phone shanty near the old farm and let it ring was the loneliest sound I've ever heard. I want to name that clearly because I do not want anyone watching this to imagine that leaving is a clean thing. It is not. It is a wound you carry forward. It is only that the wound of staying was, for me, larger. The English therapist I began seeing in the town where I settled was a small woman with reading glasses she was always losing, and plants along the sill of her office window, and a way of asking questions without pressing them into my chest. She was the one who gave me the vocabulary. Coercive control, she called it when I described the year after Jonas's death. Community enforced compliance. Consent that is not consent because the cost of saying no has been made unbearable. She said once, and I will remember it as long as I have a mind to remember with, the most effective systems of control are the ones that feel exactly like love. She said, another time, that a community that cannot hold your questions does not actually trust its own answers. She taught me that grief that is dictated is not grief. It is performance. And a woman who is asked to perform her grief for 12 months in a specific fabric, in a specific volume, under the specific supervision of the men who are quietly dividing her late husband's fields, is not mourning her husband. She is being kept. I want to be careful here. I want to say what I have said before because it is true, and because I would rather say it too many times than not enough. Jonas was not a monster. He was a man raised inside the same silence I was raised inside. His brothers, who came to take the farm's decisions from my hands, were not villains. They were following a script they had been handed by their fathers, who had been handed it by theirs. The bishop who spoke my grief for me at the graveside believed he was doing me a kindness. The women at my kitchen table with their moving hands loved me in the shape of love they had been given. The system is the thing, not the people. I do not hate the Amish. The Amish gave me my work ethic, my faith, my capacity to sit still with hard things, my sisters, the memory of a mother's hands on my hair when I was small. I take those things with me. I have to. They are half of what I am, but I also take the truth. And the truth is this: there is a specific kind of grief that a widow is not allowed to have inside a system like the one I was raised in. And that grief is the grief of realizing you have spent your whole adult life inside a room whose walls were built by other people, and that when the person you loved is gone, the walls do not fall down. The walls close in. And a widow who begins to notice the walls becomes very quickly a problem the community must gently manage. If you have ever lost someone and been told, in 1,000 small ways, exactly how much you were permitted to grieve them, I see you. If you have ever worn a color of clothing for a length of time, because your community was reading your body like a public sign, I see you. If you have ever sat at a kitchen table while men divided a life you had lived and were told, gently, that you did not need to trouble yourself with such things, I see you. If you have ever been widowed and understood in the first month that you had just been demoted from a wife to a ward, I see you. If you have ever written the smallest sentence in a hidden notebook because it was the only sentence you had ever been permitted to compose in your own name, I see you. If you have ever taken a shirt off a wash line and understood in the folding of it that a decision had already been made in you months before you were ready to see it, I see you. You were not weak. You were not cold. You were not ungrateful for the years you had. You were a woman inside a system that had already written your next 30 years in a hand that was not yours and something in you refused to sign. Tell me in the comments what part of this story stayed with you tonight. Tell me your story if you are ready. I read every single one. Subscribe to the Amish stories if you have not yet. There is so much more I have not yet said, and I am only beginning, at 47 years old, to say it. Until next time, choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life. Your grief belongs to you. It always did. Even in a black dress, even in a silent kitchen, even in a year that other people tried to write in your name.